Well, I like a lot of you, probably almost all of you. I had never heard of the alt-right until I ran into it myself. During the campaign, it was towards the end of the primary season, a columnist named Robert Kagan, he's at the Brookings Institution, wrote a column for the Washington Post about the rise of fascism in the United States. And I tweeted it out on my Twitter account using just a quote from Robert Kagan's column. I can't even remember what the quote is. I mean, this is something that I do all the time. If I see a story or an article that I like or I find interesting, I'll tweet it out using some kind of catchy piece of it to just catch a reader's attention. I got something back from, I think, Emperor King Trump that just had my name, Weissman, in these three parentheses, brackets. And it's funny, I knew, I had an intuitive sense that this was some kind of anti-Semitic thing that I had never seen before. And I tweeted back at him and I said, do you care to explain? And he said, oh ho, I've belled the cat, you Ashkenazi, whatever, something bad. And from that point, he had indeed belled the cat. And then there was an absolute deluge of anti-Semitic hate just thrown at me. I mean, and when I talk about hate, I'm talking about, my face superimposed on corpses in Auschwitz, and a gate, the famous gate into Auschwitz transposed into Machen America Great Again, pictures of my head being cut off by an ISIS guy. I mean, it went on and on and on. It never, it kept going. And at first I was so startled by it that I would just say, wow. I'd kind of tweet it back out and say, look what's out there. And of course, by tweeting it out like that, it would just, wow, that guy's got like 30,000 followers. I've got 5. I'm going to send him something even worse. And it just snowballed. And I actually did understand that I was making a decision that could be second guessed. I mean, for about 24 hours, I just started sending all of these anti-Semitic tweets back out into the ether under my account so everybody could see what was happening. And I think a lot of people were really taken aback. I was taken aback. I didn't really know any of this was out there. I mean, when I grew up, I wasn't particularly a religious Jew as a kid, and I always used to joke that my Sunday school education was mostly Holocaust education. And you learn about eliminationist anti-Semitism, but you kind of learned about it as history. And suddenly, every stereotype, every line of attack that you ever read about or heard about in Sunday school was coming at you. And this was my introduction. I eventually wrote a piece for the Times Sunday Review about this experience. And then I wrote a second piece about leaving Twitter. I am back on Twitter. It's a little hard not to be on Twitter when the president-elect of the United States is communicating with my newspaper that way. It kind of quieted down to I'd get maybe 2 or 3 of these really, really nasty tweets a day. But that was it. And then Twitter really did lower the boom a couple of days ago. It was really something to behold. But that's my experience.
And just for context, some of you may have read the ADL study of this very matter. And both Yair and Jonathan are lucky enough to be in the top 10 most anti-Semitically targeted Twitter people around in the journalism community. And just so you know the scale of this, in the ADL study, they found 19,253 overtly anti-Semitic tweets sent to at least 800 journalists. And although we differ in scale, even me, an academic, I had such an experience. I was on Fox News a few weeks ago, and I am obscure, and my last name is Brown, and I received a few of these tweets, as hateful as they can be. And I'd urge all of you, after our panel, or if you know journalists, just to look at these tweets, because even the few I got, nothing compared to what Jonathan got, when I share them with friends and show them to them socially, or I'm a teacher and I've showed them to students, it's an eye-opening experience, even for someone without the profile of Jonathan and Yair like me. Yair, your story?
Thank you very much. And thank you to ADL for having me and for holding this conference. So on that study that the ADL did that you mentioned, I'm proud to say that I ranked number 2 of the most abused Jewish journalists on Twitter during this election season. And I wear it as a badge of pride. And it's actually something I think about a lot because I've been dealing with this stuff because I have a very, very Jewish name. When you see Yair Rosenberg, you might as well be named Jewy McJewface. And so it's like when I write something that you disagree with, it's a very easy thing to do to go after me because I'm Jewish. And so I've been getting this sort of stuff from people who would later become known as the alt-right for years. Before the campaign, these parentheses I'd seen before Trump became a serious candidate. There were all these sorts of tactics that these people were sort of building in order to harass Jews online. Trump became their rallying point. He became a cause. He invigorated them. He made them more enthused. And then people started noticing when these trolls went after mainstream journalists. But they've been there for a long time, which means that when they hit me in full force for the election, I already had ideas and strategies of how to deal with them. And because the discussions of anti-Semitism today are very often very dark and depressing, or in any form of bigotry, it's like, here's this thing and it's really bad, and let's talk really more about how bad it is, and how bad it has been, and how bad it's going to get. And I like to also talk about things that you can do about it. And Britain's going to talk about that in the context of corporate responsibility, in the context of companies and policymakers, and also individuals, but I'm going to focus on what people can do if this is the sort of thing that you want to do. So when I encounter an anti-Semite photoshopping me into a concentration camp or a gas chamber, or using an anti-Jewish slur, an anti-Jewish stereotype against me, I have particular responses. Most of the time, I'll just ignore it. They want attention. It's not worth it. But sometimes it's worth highlighting so that people can see it. I have a lot of followers on Twitter, many from all walks of life, Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, and many of them may not have encountered or realized that anti-Semitism is a real force today. And by highlighting it, I'm able to make them aware of it. But it's challenging because talking about bigotry is a difficult conversation because it can be dark, it can be depressing, and people don't really want that in their social media timelines and in their ecosystems because it dampens your day. And so if I just see a racist thing and I say, oh my God, that's so racist, I'm really angry, and something to this effect, it will be shared on social media by people who already agree with me and are already just as angry as I am about that thing. But it won't really reach people for whom this isn't already a reality and for whom this isn't already an issue. So I tried to figure out a way, how can I make people actually want to share anti-Semitism on Twitter, which is a difficult challenge. But I'll give you an example from today. So just this morning, actually late last night, I get a tweet from somebody saying, Trump has won, the Jewish media, we're going to shut it down, and you'll be the first to be ovened, Jew, right? And then they have a picture of like an anti-Semitic Jewish caricature. And so if you look at my Twitter feed now, and say you're bored with hearing me here, you can look me up on your phone, and you will discover, not that anyone would ever do such a thing, but if you look at and see what I did there, I excerpted the tweet, and I said to them, I don't mean to be a grammar Nazi or anything, but ovened is not a real verb, right? And then this got retweeted a lot of times, and the person got ridiculed a lot of times. And surprise, if you go look at this, the guy is still there. Twitter has not gotten rid of his account. I don't know how long that will last, but he deleted that tweet because he was tired of getting all of the mockery that was coming his way for his failed attempt to rile me up. And one of the things to understand, so this is what's going on here. What you need to understand is what these trolls do. Some of them actually believe these things that they tweet at you about Jews, but a lot of them are nihilists, a lot of them are just nasty internet users who know that they can unnerve Jews, they can make them afraid, they can make them scared, and they can make them withdraw from the discourse, say go off Twitter, or be afraid to write about certain subjects if they abuse them enough. But they don't actually believe these things, and what they're trying to do is turn this sort of trolling dynamic on you and make you uncomfortable. So if you refuse to take the bait and turn it around on them, right, they don't know what to do, and in fact, they don't like it when it's turned on them, and they will often delete their own original provocation. Another example, someone tweeted at me, why are Jews so weak and bad at sports? Now, does this guy actually believe it? I doubt it. He just thought it would get me angry. But what it actually was a fastball down the middle. And so I just excerpted his tweet and said, well, of course Jews don't really participate in athletics. That's what we use to divert the energy of the Gentiles while we take over the systems of power. So, as you can see, I just have, and the more you do this to me, the more you tweet this sort of abuse at me, the more you're giving me ammunition Because what happens there is that lots of people found that funny, just like you, and they clicked retweet really quickly because it wasn't dark, it wasn't depressing. But what they actually did was get deputized and turned into informal educators about anti-Semitism without realizing it. Which brings us to the infamous parentheses, which is these triple parentheses that anti-Semites were using, white supremacists were using on Twitter to identify Jewish journalists, to call other people to troll them, and in general just to unnerve Jews, say like, you tweet something we don't like, instead of engaging with your argument, we'll just say Rosenberg in parentheses to try to make you afraid. And I thought this was kind of silly, and so did Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, who put 3 parentheses around his name. And I thought, this is a good idea. I did the same thing. And then I tweeted, this would be fun if other people did it. So I said, if you want to show solidarity with Jews who are being harassed and mess with Twitter's Nazis, just put 3 parentheses around their name and it'll become entirely useless because everyone will have them. And then I logged off for Shabbat. And I don't use Twitter on Shabbat, and I highly recommend, even if you don't keep Shabbat, good plan. So I log off for Shabbat. I come back after Shabbat, and like thousands of people have these parentheses around them. I have Muslim followers, a Muslim follower of mine named Fahim, who writes back and says, you know, he's got 3 parentheses around his name, Fahim, and he's like, oh man, I'm Muslim. This is going to really confuse them. Yeah. And it's a way, and so that's like step 1, because we took this tool of harassment away from them. Now no one can use it. And today, no one gets harassed with this particular tool anymore because it's entirely useless. But it did something else, which is after this took off, I wrote an explainer piece for Tablet where I work, saying what this symbol meant and how we've subverted it. So in case you're seeing it, this is what it means. And then I track when people share my own stuff on social media to see where it's going, what people are saying about it. And a lot of other people wrote a very similar piece in much bigger, more prominent websites, at Vox, at Slate, at the New York Times did a piece. But I followed my particular explainer, and I saw lots of people tweeting it because people were asking them, why do you have parentheses around your name? And people I've never met and never heard of, and we've never interacted, even on Twitter, are saying, well, here's an article that explains it. And I'm only seeing mine, but there are, remember, dozens of these, so there are probably many more such interactions happening. Which means all these people who put these parentheses about their name, again, became educators on anti-Semitism. And that's my goal. My goal is to find ways to empower people to fight back, and empower people to educate, and not feel like it's a dark and depressing endeavor, but actually that you can do it and you can do it with joy. It doesn't work for everyone, and some people this can be very emotionally difficult, and if it is, you shouldn't do it, and I advise you to disengage. But for a lot of people, it can be very empowering. I talked to a retreat this past weekend of Muslim leaders who are dealing with similar stuff as Jews are right now. And all of this stuff similarly applies to them, and like conspiracies about Sharia law. And they felt it was very helpful to them because all the time they're being told that, like, you know, batten down the hatches, and they're told that they need to like deal with these things in a political way, and it's true. But there are also ways to show solidarity online in the systems that we inhabit today. And I think that that's really important for all of us, regardless of what companies and policymakers do. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to take one moment first to explain why I personally care about this as well. 10 years ago, I was actually the Jane Doe plaintiff in a highly publicized cyber harassment suit. So when I came into ADL, I was already aware of this issue and interested in it on both a personal and a professional level. Like you both, I was told first to just ignore it, and I ignored all of the harassment until it got to the point where it crossed over into real-life consequences. And I think that that's the point we're at now. The reason we did the first report, which was really unique because it was a quantitative analysis, not just reporting all the bad things that people said on Twitter, but really looking at who was doing the harassment, what the scope of it was, where it was coming from, and how many people it reached. My favorite, if you can have a favorite, I think one of the statistics that came out of this study that really speaks to me is that the reach of the anti-Semitic language was equivalent to a $20 million Super Bowl ad. So I think it says a lot about the normalization of this kind of speech. So taking those results and translating them into action items was the next part of ADL's project. And I think a few of you have this at your seat, but this came out today. It is Control-Alt-Delete, recommendations of the ADL task force on the online harassment of journalists. And what we've done is we've broken it down into 3 different areas: recommendations for industry, recommendations for journalists, advocates, and targets, and recommendations for law enforcement and policymakers. We're going to have a speaker following from Twitter who's going to explain about the actions that they've taken very recently to really track this head on. But ADL, I guess to encapsulate it, we think that social platforms need better reporting options. They need to improve the response time about these complaints. They need to invest in new tools to curb cyber harassment. They need to work on transparency about their abuse process reviews. That's the nutshell. For industry, I think it boils down to two main things: context and re-victimization. When people are harassed online, oftentimes, and when we did I'm gonna rewind for a second. To gather the recommendations for this report, we consulted with our task force, which was composed of top journalists, academics, and people affected by this issue. I individually consulted with over 150 outside experts from law enforcement, journalists, academics, advocates, lawyers, and tech people. And so that's how we distilled what the problem was and the solutions that we could derive from it. So if you look at the report, we have over 25 specific recommendations that can be implemented by these groups. So if you look at industry, a lot of it focuses on context. When people are harassed, they complain that they cannot explain the context, because if you're being harassed in 140 characters, it's really hard to explain why you feel intimidated or threatened. So we're recommending that the tech companies allow for further explanation and also train the people who are supposed to be evaluating these complaints. Oftentimes, they come from different contexts than the people who are being harassed. And so to understand that, you need to provide some means of explanation. Kind of going with this is that we also recommend more transparency in these complaint and review processes. Because most of the time when people would complain, they'd say, we don't know what the hell is going on. Sometimes we get our complaint accepted, sometimes we get it rejected, but we're complaining about the same things. So transparency in how these processes work would help people engage with it. I also think that focusing on re-victimization is an important aspect of this, because when people are being deluged with thousands of messages every day, and they're just one person, you have to understand the burden that it puts on somebody to have to try to find each one of these, report them all individually, and track the spread of these messages. So we've recommended that there be more efficiency when people have to make multiple complaints, and to not have to have people relive this painful experience again and again and again when they're trying to mitigate the harms. For journalists and targets and advocates, there were three things that we looked at specifically. And if you look at the report, we actually did a portrait of the most interesting things coming out of the tech industry in the last 2 months. And so this is not a comprehensive portrait, but it's really highlighting people who are doing interesting things that haven't been tried before. One is using positive counter speech, which, like you said, is beating trolls at their own game. Some of these groups are using more speech to educate. Some of them are gathering positive counter mobs, where when they see someone being harassed, they will unleash a wave of aggressive love towards that person. And it works. It drowns out the hate speech. We've profiled new tools for journalists. There's one suite called the Coral Project that's being put out by Mozilla that's going to allow journalists to have more control over how they present their information, how the comments section works, and it's from individual bloggers all the way up to major platforms. And then recommending that people apply smart cybersecurity measures. For lawmakers and policymakers, we'd like to make sure that state laws are modernized that actually reflect the way that people are abused online. Just applying state analogs for stalking or for other types of violent crime to cyber laws doesn't translate. We'd like more funding for law enforcement and training, because if you're harassed, what they tell you is, oh, go to the police. You have to go to the police. That's the first thing. And the response that most people get is, turn off your computer, which does not address the problem, especially when the harms translate into real-life consequences. So we want to make sure that the state and local officers, who are this first line of defense, have the resources and training that they need to take this seriously. Part of this is criminalizing new forms like swatting and doxing. Doxing is when somebody takes your personal information, like your phone number and your address and your social security number, and they put it online with a call to action for people to harass you. It's quite damaging for the target of that. Additionally, there's swatting, where somebody pretends to be you. They will spoof your phone number, and they will call and say that there is a murder going on at your house right now, and the SWAT team needs to be there right away. So law enforcement and the SWAT team, guns blazing, shows up at your house. Again, the potential for serious, serious consequences. And I think the final recommendation from ADL is that we invest in innovative research. And this is for the tech industry and for the entrepreneurs and really for all of us to try to engage. We would like to promote something that we call anti-harassment by design. This is in the same vein as privacy by design or cybersecurity by design, where we want people who are developing platforms to think about solutions proactively before there's a problem. It is much easier to build protections and think about these concerns when you're making something rather than adding it on at the end. And I think with that's a nice capsule summary, but if you look in your app, you can actually see the text of the full reports, and it should be available online. Thank you.
Britton, you're relatively new to ADL, and I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position, but ADL has been outspoken about Trump-related issues, including Steve Bannon, who you could argue has a journalistic platform that he controls. Do you have a point of view about the implications of that going forward for what we're talking about?
I mean, not for ADL.
Okay.
I think that you should look at the situation holistically and focusing on one of the problems that I have found with the abuse that's going on Twitter is that it acts as a megaphone. You know, it's not just one person telling you you're horrible, you're bad, you're Jewish, and that means something wrong. It amplifies that 10, 20, 50, 100-fold. And based on the nature of the platform, it doesn't go away. And sometimes when people are harassed in that way, I believe that's what drives them off of the platform. And I think what affects journalists in particular. Because if you were to go to work every day and open your computer screen and see hundreds of people telling you how bad, stupid, and flawed you were, you wouldn't stay in that job very long. So I think putting somebody in a position like that sets a tone. And it is that tone that we see reflected again and again and again, which can be problematic.